In this news roundup of the week for 4th of November 2022, America prepares itself for midterm elections as late polls suggest that Republicans may soon control both houses. Brazil's President Bolsonaro narrowly loses his election, but does that actually mean the Amazon rainforest is safe? Rishi Sunak changes his mind about going to COP27. We review the issues up for debate at the climate conference, and in this week's short thought, how almost unnoticed we are now at the point where you can be jailed for private speech. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Polls in the US as the country prepares to vote next week show a shift in intentions, suggesting a significant red wave for Republicans. The odds that they will take both the House and the Senate have significantly improved on these latest figures. Certain seats that would normally be solid blue have become more strongly contested, including formerly solid Democrat areas such as New York, where 9 of the state's 26 congressional seats have become real battlegrounds. And even the governor race has become a lot closer than it was. As far as I can tell from a distance, this reflects the fact that Republicans have fought a largely focused campaign on issues that people care about, specifically the economy and crime in those areas that have seen increases post-pandemic. And Democrats have led a scattergun approach on their favoured topics, from abortion to race to climate change and various other things, which have generally failed to connect beyond their base. And their responses to the concerns on the other side have often just reminded people that they are focused on their obsessions. For example, Biden's White House tweeted that the increase in Social Security was a Biden policy triumph, only to see that quickly deleted when it was pointed out the increase was actually automatically matching the inflation rate. Not such a good thing. And more substantially, a number of Democrat campaigners have tried to make the case that Republicans focusing on crime is really just an undercover way of talking about race. So if crime's gone up in your area, as it has in New York for instance, and you're somewhat concerned about it, having it implied that the only reason for that concern must be closet racism, you can see why that might be an unsatisfactory pitch. And in spite of abortion having been made a major issue and the Democrats' presumption that they own what they refer to as women's issues, the shift in polling has been particularly marked amongst white suburban women, as well as Latino voters. It turns out they care about the economy and crime as well. Who'd have thought it? In the last few campaigning days, Biden and former President Obama made the other pitch, that with so many 2020 election deniers on the ballot, the integrity of democracy itself was at stake. So Biden said this: "It's estimated that there are more than 300 election deniers on the ballot all across America this year. We can't ignore the impact this is having on our country. It's damaging, it's corrosive, and it's destructive." There's a good argument for that being the case, but the Democrat Party has to a large degree undermined its ability to make that case. First and foremost because in the primary campaigns of this election, Democrats funded precisely some of those people to try to get the most extreme MAGA types onto the ballot. They did it presuming that they would be easier then for them to beat. Now they're all looking worried. I mean, if you genuinely believe that someone is a fundamental threat to democracy, is that really how you behave? You donate to their campaign? Really? Secondly, I think the public have a right to be very wary of the argument that goes, if you don't vote for me, you lose democracy. Democracy being, I remind you, the freedom to vote for whoever you want. But you can't do that in this election. Whether you like me or not, you only have one choice, or else democracy dies, which would imply that you've already lost your democracy if that was the case. Bear in mind, I say this as someone who does take the placing of those who would have overturned the 2020 result in positions of authority. I take that very seriously. I agree that US democracy is looking extremely fragile, but do not swallow the line that it's all down to the other side, so vote for me. And ignore while you're doing it, presumably, that the party's troubles in New York have been exacerbated by the fact that a Democrat attempt to gerrymander the districts was blocked. In Georgia, Stacey Abrams, the candidate for governor, who refused to accept the election result when she lost last time, argued that there was voter suppression going on, in spite of record early voter turnout in the state. Such things are minor in the scale compared to the organisation of so-called election deniers on the GOP side, but they are high profile and they're reminders that the problem with American democracy is that it's susceptible to partisan influences from both sides. Biden may be right to point the finger, but it was only yesterday that it was the assembled mainstream media who are keeping the wholly legitimate story about Hunter Biden out of sight in order to directly influence the last election in Biden's favour, amongst various other things. And some of the people who are numbered amongst those 300 so-called election deniers are simply people who believe that the election was sort of rigged because of behaviour like that. So it's not that all of them signed 100% onto the Trump line, not that all of them would necessarily deny democracy. It's a reflection of how much democratic mandates have degraded in the US in recent years. Although that said, there are certainly some people of serious concern numbered amongst the mix. The US has just had a shocking moment when a solitary nutjob was able to break into Pelosi's home, leading to an actual assault with a hammer against Paul Pelosi. That couldn't happen this close to an election without Democrats jumping on it on the one hand, claiming this was the natural consequence of the rhetoric on the other side, which was not something they felt applied when a Bernie Sanders supporter shot up a GOP baseball practice. And correctly so. Unless politicians specifically call for violence, they are not responsible for the actions of disturbed individuals. Not then, and then not in this case either. And of course, some of the figures on the Trump wing were quickly spreading fanciful stories of their own about the circumstances of the Pelosi attack, also unedifying. So yes, how elections are fought is a real problem. How they get distorted differs between the two sides, but both sides can point with some degree of validity to aspects of the process. Hence, the centre ground voters may be disinclined to take the warnings of one side about the intentions of the other at face value. And so it seems. So the polls suggest that Americans generally were not much moved by the pitch of either side. And only a minority of independents and Republicans said that if they agreed with a candidate on most positions, they would not vote for them if they also said that the 2020 election was stolen. What will happen if Republicans take both houses in the elections? Well, I rather expect to quickly have one of the few political predictions I've made to be relatively rapidly confirmed. When Democrats started the impeachment process of Trump, the first time they did it, seemed to me to be one big fishing expedition. Something that they'd always intended to do as soon as they thought they had enough material. It was an obvious prediction to make, and I did make, that exactly that move would now become a standard part of the polarised playbook. I would be surprised if that didn't turn into reality sometime in the next 2 years, if Republicans win in the way that's predicted. As they say, it's not over until it's over. This time next week, we will know the results. In Brazil, of course, it is indeed over, for now anyway, in a result that gladdened the heart of foreign environmentalists and technocratic leaders. Jair Bolsonaro was narrowly defeated by former President Luiz Lula da Silva. Their hope was that this would see Brazil return to the fold of those nations seriously concerned to act on climate change, and most specifically to reverse the rapid deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, which had become a feature of the previous incumbent's reign. Which is all well and good, of course, but ultimately there are many difficult domestic issues. Lula da Silva is going to have a real hard time in actually governing his country. The runoff election was extremely close, 1.8 percentage points. Bolsonaro had been making Trump-like noises before, suggesting that the only way he would lose would be if there was election fraud. But although he pointedly didn't concede the result, his side did indicate it would follow the constitution in preparing for the transfer of power. Some lorry drivers that were supporters had been blocking roads in protest, and Bolsonaro told them to stand down. Brazil has become extremely politically polarised, with a great deal of political distance between the left and the Bolsonaro right. In torrents of defamation and misinformation that make the US look almost restrained, the left have been spreading stories about Bolsonaro being a cannibalistic paedophile. The right have been suggesting that Lula is a satanic communist who will shut down all the churches and follow Venezuela into far-left authoritarianism. When Lula was last elected, it was by a landslide, this time by a tiny minority. And with the public finances in much worse shape, he will have very little room for manoeuvre. If you were in that position, you would presume that you needed to govern from the centre, which it seems from his victory speech is what he intends. So he vowed to be the president for all Brazilians, not just those who voted for him. Now, of course, that has echoes of Joe Biden promising to be a uniter, not a divider. When politics is so polarised, it turns out to be incredibly hard to deliver that, not least because the appetite for it on your own side won't be that high. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro will have been getting inspiration, no doubt, from a return in Israel of Benjamin Netanyahu and operating on the assumption that an early return for himself will also be possible, indeed likely. But what about all those outside hopes? How easy will it be for Lula to deliver on the hopes for an end to Amazon deforestation? Given the closeness of a result, not much is going to be taken for granted. Relatively hostile Congress is likely to block his efforts. There are lots of people in the country who were convinced by Bolsonaro's argument that environmental protection was bought at the cost of lost livelihoods for Brazilians. In his earlier periods of office, deforestation dropped around 80% due to the creation of key protected areas and resources put into law enforcement. A pre-election analysis by the website Carbon Brief estimated that Lula could achieve an even greater drop this time, 89% by 2030. But is that a political reality? Well, it requires persuading that hostile right-leaning Congress to assist in overturning Bolsonaro's legislation. I'm going to believe that when I see it. The point is that more than half of the states that cover the forest area voted for Bolsonaro. Resource extraction and cattle raising are often the only obvious sources of existence there. So Lula would very much be seen to be doing conservation to them, not with them, given the absence of any strong alternative plan to create jobs that benefit from forest preservation. Now, maybe it's achievable to create such a plan. You wouldn't expect it to be achievable quickly. The new president has more pushing against him than he has working for him right now, to all appearances. No doubt that's something he'll be discussing with well-wishers when he attends the COP27 climate conference in Egypt, which he's confirmed he will be doing next week. And after a not especially surprising U-turn, it now appears that the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will also be attending COP27. At least we know he won't be bumping into Greta Thunberg while he's there. She has dismissed the whole operation as a waste of time, just a bunch of greenwashing. So it's a fair question. What is this year's major gathering supposed to be about? What's actually up for negotiation? What might it achieve? Firstly, the key issue is the obvious gap between the pledges that countries have made and the scale of emission cuts believed to be required to keep the world on track for the Paris Agreement goals of well below 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C. As I've said before, it's fairly self-evident that the world's not going to organise itself to hit the latter of those two. Whether this is the year that people start to come to terms with that is an open question, given that a lot of the discourse has erroneously led quite a few people to believe that 1.5 degrees is a cliff face, which if we drop off the edge of it, it's going to be a catastrophe. That's not true, so it'll be interesting to see how the cognitive dissonance plays out as the world starts to come to terms with the fact that it's not going to hit 1.5. None of that means that it wouldn't have been good to hit 1.5, it's just that 1.6 is incrementally worse and 1.7 is incrementally worse. There is no cliff edge. In principle, after the last conference in Glasgow, countries were supposed to update their plans to push the bar higher every year. Just 24 countries have submitted revised plans on that basis this year. Commentators and participants in the process seem disinclined to notice at all that world events have not exactly been conducive to focus on this issue, with a major energy crisis pushing people to use whatever sources of energy might be available to them. In addition to that conversation, a lot of focus will move on to the question of mitigation and adaptation, and particularly for developing countries, some of which are the most vulnerable and likely to be the hardest hit. Those countries are pushing for the principle of loss and damage to be accepted, which would result in a finance facility to compensate them for serious harms to their countries from climate change, recognising that they didn't cause or benefit from the emissions that caused it. As you can imagine, this very quickly gets into sticky territory. Developed countries might be sympathetic to the principle, but they're not going to sign up to something that could turn into a blank cheque. Plus, really, the science of attributing individual events to human-caused climate change is still somewhat contentious. And since every small country has an incentive to claim that every weather extreme they ever face in the future is because of climate change, because that's the ticket to external funding, you would very easily set up a system that has perverse incentives baked into its core. So far, funding for developing countries has focused on helping them to reduce their own emissions. Increasingly now, the focus is moving towards adaptation. Because the difference between a climate extreme that causes massive damage and one that can be shrugged off relatively easily can simply be about how well developed that country's infrastructure is. So the upshot of a lot of all of this is the conference, let's face it, is going to be about money. Developed nations had already pledged $100 billion per year climate finance fund, and that hasn't been delivered. And there's a question of how much the target may be increased after 2025, which becomes irrelevant if it's not going to be delivered. Developing countries are also pushing back against the idea that climate finance includes loans rather than grants. Highly indebted countries don't feel that they can afford more loans, as you might expect. You might think that a conference that focuses primarily on money at a time of global economic problems, inflation, energy crisis and all the rest of it is probably not set up for headlining successes. And I'd say the odds were against it. There will be various smaller triumphs that will be trumpeted during the course of the event, no doubt. What we may see is the final disconnection of the process from the more campaigning end of the environmentalist movement. I mentioned Greta Thunberg earlier. She's been doing the rounds this week to promote a book that she's edited and contributed to, and in the course of that promotion she has declared what was always obviously going to happen. She is now a full dyed-in-the-wool anti-capitalist. She now defines herself as against, quote, the system defined by colonialism, imperialism, oppression and genocide by the so-called global north to accumulate wealth that still shapes our current world order. Unsurprising? Young person hangs around with mostly anti-capitalist radicals, eventually absorbs the beliefs and values of her peer group. And yes, that does mean that she now pitches her tent firmly outside the rooms where actual practical solutions are being discussed and agreed, outside the factories where innovation in practical solutions is taking place, and so on. And that's a shame, because she could have been highly influential in encouraging the next generation of young people to embrace a role taking their place in being part of creating those solutions, rather than the howling at the moon approach to changing the world. But it is what it is. The UK has been having a debate in recent times about something called the Online Harms Bill. Most contentiously, the bill promised to push social media companies to take action over content that was rated as legal but harmful. People rightly looked at that phrase and wondered just how huge a hole in free speech that implied with its vagueness. Bearing in mind that in some people's minds saying all sorts of things is not just something they might disagree with, but something that they say can cause actual harm. And if there's ambiguity, you create the incentives for the companies to play it safe, to err on the side of presuming that something should be taken down. You may feel that things are bad enough on that front already, but this bill could have made it a lot worse. Now it seems that under new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, that component of the bill is likely to be dropped, at least for adults. And I get that, because it's really vulnerable young people whose situation formed the real justification for that part of the bill. Young people who might be, for instance, viewing self-harm content, who are encouraged over time to take similar action themselves. And that is a real problem. Some aspects of social media are disastrous for a specific group of people. But at a time when we see numerous instances of police forces overzealously embracing the role of thought police, contacting people over their Twitter content, it's clear that the bill as drafted was a disaster waiting to happen. However, Unfortunately, with that piece of apparent good news, it's easy to miss the fact we've already shifted into a difficult place. You can already go to jail. Not just be fined, go to jail for offensive things that you post on a communication system, regardless of whether it was even public or not. That's Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003. This week, police officers were sentenced to 3 months in prison for having shared genuinely offensive jokes on a private WhatsApp group. Yes, the messages were unpleasant. They weren't intended to be read by anyone beyond that group. It was a private discussion. It only came to light when one of their phones was inspected in relation to a separate case. Now, of course, instead of putting it onto a private WhatsApp group, they could have just told those jokes to each other in a pub or in one of their own living rooms. Would we expect them to go to jail for that? Whereas the Online Harms Bill created controversy and outrage, nobody in authority seems to be much concerned by the implications of this case. The judge said that she felt the offending material was actually worse for the fact that it wasn't public. Private thoughts expressed privately are now to be hunted down and punished, it seems. So, fine. You might think, and I might think, we don't tell jokes to our friends about the victims of violence and rape and whatever deeply disagreeable things they were sharing. At least I hope you don't. So, great, this won't affect us. But once you've established the principle, private conversations between consenting adults can be policed, you've given away something incredibly important. The Online Harms Bill showed one thing, which was how movable the definition of what's considered harmful can actually be. It's obvious how this could go horribly wrong. Alright, my thanks to those who support the non-harmful public speech on this channel by being Patreon subscribers. They make it possible for these videos to happen. They also do things like provide questions for Q&A videos, the most recent of which went live on Wednesday, so have a look for that if you haven't seen it already. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.